audio articles, presented by Off-Gassing, a scuba podcast, narrated by Daniel Porter.
National Speleological Society, Cave Diving Section, Accident Analysis Committee Report. Phantom Lake Spring, Jeff Davis County, Texas, USA, October 4th, 2023. Location: Phantom Lake Spring is located in West Texas near the town of Balmeria. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, who has owned the property since 1948, recently transferred ownership back to the surrounding landowner. Karst Underwater Research negotiated access with the landowner, who was familiar with the team from their previous project dives 10 years prior. Despite the name, there is no longer a lake, and the cave no longer discharges at the spring. All the water now continues into the downstream passage and ultimately discharges at San Solomon Springs, about 3.7 miles away. The first 5,500 feet upstream is relatively shallow and varies from 0 feet of fresh water to 60 feet of fresh water, with an average depth of 30 feet of fresh water. At 5,500 feet penetration, the cave descends first gradually, then stair-steps down to 330 feet of fresh water, at which point the cave drops vertically to 462 feet of fresh water. Dive narrative. Two divers, Brett Hemphill and Andrew Pitkin, entered Phantom Spring at approximately 10:45 on October 4th, 2023. Their objective was to continue exploration of the cave from their previous limit in 2013, which was at a depth of 462 feet of fresh water. In the preceding days, the team had installed a decompression habitat at a depth of 30 feet fresh water and about 5,500 feet penetration from the cave entrance, where all the decompression would have to be done, along with cylinders of safety gas. All exploration divers on the project were using rebreathers for bailout. Hemphill and Pitkin reached Magnus Hall, the point at which they had turned around in 2013 because of a DPV flood, uneventfully, and Hemphill tied his reel while Pitkin installed a safety cylinder on the line. They then followed the passage for another 350 feet as it descended in a series of steps to 570 feet of fresh water, where Hemphill tied off the reel while Pitkin prepared to survey the new passage. The survey proceeded uneventfully, with Hemphill remaining behind Pitkin as he surveyed. Back at the start of their exploration in Magnus Hall at 460 feet of fresh water, Pitkin continued surveying the upsloping guideline leading back up to the 330 feet of freshwater horizontal passage. This was the last point of visual contact between the divers. Unaware of any problems, Pitkin continued surveying up out of the room until he reached the end of his previous survey at 330 feet of fresh water. When he realized that Hemphill was no longer with him, he looked back down through the opening into the passage leading into Magnus Hall. When he didn't see Hemphill's light, he went back up to check the whole length, 200 feet, of the horizontal passage at 330 feet of fresh water. But the absence of any silt percolation in the passage ascending from it made it clear that Hemphill had not proceeded ahead of him. Pitkin therefore traveled back through the horizontal passage, down the fissure, and into the passage leading to Magnus Hall. As he rounded the corner into the room, he saw that the previous good visibility had been reduced to near zero by a cloud of dense gray silt. Pitkin was having problems with his rebreather, erratic oxygen sensor readings, and made the decision that attempting to find Hemphill in such poor visibility would be unsuccessful and possibly dangerous at that depth. He therefore reluctantly started ascending slowly in the hope that Hemphill would catch him up. Visibility in the tunnel steadily declined to less than 3 feet. Some reduction in visibility was expected from experience during previous dives due to percolation of silt from the ceiling by bubbles, but this was significantly worse. During his decompression stop at 160 feet of fresh water, Pitkin experienced back pain and severe paresthesia in both legs, suggesting an incipient spinal cord decompression injury. He immediately descended to 240 feet of fresh water and prepared to go deeper if the symptoms did not improve. There was still no sign of Hemphill. Greatly extending his decompression schedule, Pitkin gradually ascended to 50 feet of fresh water, where he was met by Bob Beckner and Gary Donahue, the support divers. They had appropriate gas to search to 120 feet of fresh water and did so without locating Hemphill. They therefore returned to the cave entrance to get appropriate gas for a deeper search. Meanwhile, Pitkin continued his decompression until he arrived at the habitat at 30 feet of fresh water, where he was able to confirm with the surface team via radio that Hemphill was still missing and request additional open-circuit safety gas for the exit. His rebreather oxygen sensors were producing conflicting readings, and he thought he might have to make a long, difficult zero-visibility exit on open circuit. The support team dived again, this time to 180 feet of fresh water, in search of Hemphill, but was unable to find him. Over the next 6 hours, during decompression in the habitat, it became clear that Hemphill was not returning. During this time, Pitkin had evaluated his rebreather in the habitat and determined that he could use it safely for the exit journey, and eventually surfaced after 16.5 hours underwater. Search and recovery. The following day, October 5th, having had a few hours of sleep, the team prepared to search for Hemphill. Uppermost in everyone's minds was the safety of the recovery team. Careful review of Pitkin's helmet camera video showed Hemphill's light moving normally nearby during the first part of the survey. It also confirmed his recollection that he had last seen Hemphill in Magnus Hall. The next day, October 6th, Bob Beckner and Charlie Roberson dived to Magnus Hall and found Hemphill there on his back on top of the abandoned Magnus Diver Propulsion Vehicle, or DPV, at a depth of 460 feet of fresh water, at approximately 7,200 feet of penetration from the cave entrance. Visibility was good. The primary CCR loop was out of his mouth by a few inches, and his eyes were closed with the mask on. His backup rebreather loop and other emergency equipment were still stowed in their normal positions. The green buddy light on the top of his CCR was still alight. He was not entangled in the guideline, and there was no major disturbance visible in the surrounding silt. Beckner and Roberson brought Hemphill from 460 feet of fresh water to the start of the horizontal passage at 320 feet of fresh water and secured him there while they made their exit. The following day, October 7th, having allowed some time for the visibility to improve, Jason Richards and Bob Beckner moved Hemphill from 320 feet of fresh water up to 80 feet of fresh water, where they handed him over to Gary Donahue and Matt Van Zandt, who took him to a depth of about 40 feet of fresh water in the rock room. This involved negotiating the only restriction in the cave passage. The recovery divers attempted several times to close the primary BOV at depth, but were unable to until 80 feet of fresh water. The next day, October 8th, John Burnett and Charlie Roberson moved Hemphill part-way through the shallow 5,500 foot of passage, having had to return once to the entrance for more weight. The next day, October 8th, John Burnett and Charlie Roberson moved Hemphill part-way through the shallow 5,500 feet of passage, having had to return once to the entrance for more weight. Finally, Beckner, Richards, and Jeff Frank completed the recovery to the entrance, where they handed Hemphill over to the sheriff's office. Analysis. Underwater cave survey, especially at extreme depths, is a task that requires a great deal of cognitive focus, in addition to the necessity of managing diving equipment. Because of this, it was normal for this team to not always maintain close visual contact throughout the survey process. Sometimes one diver would go ahead of the other to improve the line routing, for example. It was usual for this team to reestablish team order at the end of the survey for the exit journey, and Hemphill's absence at this point was the first indication of any problem. Careful review of Pitkin's helmet-mounted video camera shows Hemphill's light intermittently appearing during the survey process. When Pitkin arrived back to Magnus Hall, he looked back and caught a glimpse of Hemphill about 20 feet behind. At that point, Hemphill appeared to be composed and not signaling. As Pitkin ascended the vertical line in Magnus Hall, a close review of the video footage reveals Hemphill's light moving erratically against the white wall, possibly trying to signal him. The video light mounted on Pitkin's DPV makes Hemphill's signal difficult to see, and he did not notice Hemphill's light at the time. Examination of Hemphill's equipment, both underwater and at the surface, showed no obvious malfunctions or unexpected findings. His side-mounted primary diluent and bailout cylinder was a pressed steel low-pressure 120 cubic feet, equipped with a dual-outlet Lola valve worn on the diver's right. Both valves were open, and regulators were functional. At the surface, the cylinder had 57 psi of gas left, consistent with continuous loss of loop gas and automatic addition of diluent by the ADV after the loop mouthpiece came out of his mouth. The wing and dry suit were inflated at times during the recovery from his cylinder to help control buoyancy. Analysis of the remaining gas showed 5% oxygen, 90.7% helium, equal to 5.6% oxygen at sea level. Note that all gas analysis was done at the cave entrance, at an altitude of approximately 3,400 feet above sea level. On his back-mounted primary CCR dive soft Liberty, the valve on his onboard oxygen cylinder, a low-pressure steel 45 cubic foot, was open with 2,570 psi and was analyzed at 90.7%, equal to 100% at sea level. The onboard air, also an LP45 cylinder, used for suit and wing inflation, had an open valve. It contained only 17 psi and was analyzed at 19.7% oxygen, equal to 22% at sea level. The wing and dry suit were inflated at times during the recovery to help control buoyancy. The side-mounted bailout CCR, Dive Soft Liberty side mount, was still in dive mode and was attached in its normal diving position with the loop and mouthpiece stowed. The DSV was in the closed position. It was configured with 2 onboard oxygen cylinders, both of which had open valves. The gas in both cylinders was analyzed at 90.8%, equal to 100% at sea level. Cylinder 1 had 2,907 psi, and Cylinder 2 had 102 psi, consistent with the controller adding oxygen to the loop during recovery. Data downloaded from Hemphill's primary back-mounted unit showed no evidence of a malfunction of the CCR, but did have an unexpected finding. The depth record showed that Hemphill had ascended from the deepest point of the dive back towards Magnus Hall, manually adding oxygen to boost the PO2 to 1.1 to 1.2. He was using a controller PO2 set point of 0.75. On arrival at 485 feet of fresh water, at which point the loop PO2 had dropped to 0.79, he again added oxygen to the loop, this time pushing the PO2 briefly to 2.75 ATA, although it dropped back to 1.79 after about 30 seconds. This maneuver was repeated as he continued ascending, with additional manual oxygen addition between the high PO2 spikes to keep the loop between 1.0 and 1.6 ATA. He continued to ascend into Magnus Hall and continued to ascend slowly to 448 feet, which is near the ceiling of that part of the room, and then descended about 10 feet, after which the slight changes in depth suggest he was mid-water with neutral buoyancy. He then manually injected even more oxygen, pushing the loop PO2 briefly to 3.17 ATA. It fell again rapidly to 1.7 ATA, after which he continued to add small amounts of oxygen for the next 2 or 3 minutes, and his depth increased slowly to 460 feet of freshwater, after which it did not change again. After this point, the loop PO2 fell at a constant rate without manual or automatic oxygen addition to 1.13 ATA over the next 10 minutes. This could represent metabolic oxygen consumption, or dilution of the loop contents by the ADV, adding gas to compensate for volume lost from the loop through an open mouthpiece. Subsequently, there is no further oxygen consumption from the loop, and the depth also remains constant. Hemphill was one of the most experienced deep cave explorers in the world, and had been diving many different rebreathers, including extensively modified manual CCRs, for decades. There is no evidence whatsoever that he had a problem related to guideline entanglement, navigation errors, or propulsion, and he had managed rebreather faults underwater on many occasions. DPVs, lights, regulators, valves, and rebreathers appear functional. Breathing gases were appropriate for the dive and labeled correctly. Mask was on his face, hands and suit were clean, and cave floor undamaged. The most likely explanation by far for the repeated rises in loop oxygen levels is that he deliberately injected oxygen manually. An alternative cause would be a solenoid or manual addition valve, MAV, malfunction intermittently pushing large amounts of oxygen repeatedly into the rebreather. But this raises the question of why Hemphill made no effort to switch to his backup rebreather, a procedure he had practiced frequently and recently. He told Pitkin during pre-dive planning that one of the problems he would be especially watchful for was a sudden PO2 spike. Two main possibilities exist for Hempel's reason for adding oxygen. He was either experiencing severe decompression sickness or some other medical problem. The former is unlikely at a depth of 480 feet of freshwater following a maximum depth of 570 feet of freshwater, and would have to be progressed over tens of minutes to impairing him sufficiently that he was unable to use his DPV. He had often mentioned to friends that another well-known cave diver, who had suffered a heart attack underwater in a cave, had been told by his doctor that he had survived because of the high PO2 in his breathing gas. It is possible that if Hempel was experiencing symptoms that he thought might be a heart attack, he might have tried to push his loop PO2 as high as he dared in order to help himself. Any putative cause of this accident must explain why Hempel, with his experience, was unable to rescue himself. If his problem was hypercapnia, either due to scrubber breakthrough or respiratory failure, he would have undoubtedly at least attempted to switch to his bailout CCR, probably via a few open-circuit breaths using the primary unit's bailout valve, or BOV. The brief periods of hyperoxia appear to be deliberate, and are probably too short to have caused significant CNS oxygen toxicity. Decompression sickness that could have severely disabled him seems highly unlikely at the depth at which the incident occurred, and HPNS can be similarly ruled out. The only likely explanation, based on the evidence at the scene of the accident, is a significant non-diving medical problem, almost certainly a cardiac one. Studies of causes of diving fatalities have shown that a substantial portion are due to a pre-existing cardiac disease, especially in older and more experienced divers. Why cardiac events seem to occur commonly underwater is unclear, but may relate to physical exertion, psychological stress, or other unknown factors. At least one study is underway to try to document asymptomatic cardiac dysrhythmias in divers. In Hempel's case, he clearly became disabled rapidly enough that he was unable to even start making his ascent out of Magnus Hall. The most likely explanation is a ventricular arrhythmia, possibly triggered by myocardial ischemia, which may have then progressed, as often happens, into ventricular fibrillation. Confidential medical information. The post-mortem examination was compromised by the delay in extricating him from the cave. It was not possible to determine definitively whether there was any intracranial pathology. His heart had a 30% stenosis in the dominant right coronary artery and an area of fibrosis in the intraventricular septum, most likely a small previous infarct. There was extensive atheroma in the aorta and major arteries. All other findings could have been results of the delay and depth changes during recovery. Hempel had seen a cardiologist for chest pain and episodes of slow heart rate. He had an exercise test which he claimed had no red flags, although it appears that during the test he did have ECG changes, some atrial and one ventricular arrhythmia. He complained of episodes of epigastric pain that he attributed to indigestion, and asked Pitkin to pack some antacids in the provisions for the decompression habitat on the day of the dive. Conclusion and lessons learned. The evidence available strongly points to a sudden cardiac problem, probably a ventricular dysrhythmia, as being the cause of Hempel's death. Hempel was a 56-year-old male with a history of visits to a cardiologist, which suggests the presence of cardiac-related symptoms that led him to seek diagnosis and treatment. All divers, particularly those doing deep or overhead diving, should seriously consider their fitness for diving to include an annual physical exam. Ideally, this exam should be performed by a certified hyperbaric physician or to a higher standard, such as a flight medical. If Pitkin and Hempel had been in closer proximity during Hempel's likely medical event, it could have easily been a double fatality given the depth and distance from the entrance. That being said, protocols that improve team cohesion and communications, particularly during highly focused tasks such as a survey, should be considered.
Off-gassing, a scuba podcast.